This man rescued a dying bear, and what happened after left everyone in tears. Ethan Caldwell never imagined that one fateful autumn afternoon would change his life forever. Wandering through a secluded trail in the Alaskan wilderness, he stumbled upon an emaciated, barely breathing grizzly, a sight that wrenched his heart and sparked an act of courage he never knew he possessed. The bear's pained eyes reflected a silent plea for help, and with trembling hands, Ethan vowed not to abandon it. What followed was a story so poignant and transformative that it would leave everyone, friends, strangers, even hardened rangers, shedding tears. This is the tale of a dying bear's rescue, the bond forged in adversity, and the miracles that followed. Ethan Caldwell grew up in a small New England town, the kind where neighbors shared sugar and gossip in equal measure. But after losing his parents at 18, a car accident on a slippery winter road, he felt an unshakable emptiness. In an effort to cope, Ethan turned inward. He spent his days tinkering with old cars and losing himself in thick library books. The older he grew, the more he craved open space. He yearned to escape the well-intentioned pity of familiar faces and find a place where he could truly breathe again. When he was 25, Ethan left behind everything he knew and drove north, chasing the allure of Alaskan horizons. It was the classic dream, the call of snow-capped peaks and the promise of absolute freedom. He settled in a small cabin on the edge of the Kenai Peninsula, about an hour's drive from the nearest grocery store. Life became about raw essentials, chopping wood, fishing for salmon in the icy river, and adapting to the unpredictable Alaskan climate. Gone were the crowded sidewalks, in their place stretched pine forests and mountain silhouettes against endless skies. The isolation suited him. Out here, no one looked at him with that careful sympathy that had always left him uneasy. If he felt the weight of sorrow, he had the forest and the wind to keep him company rather than prying eyes. Over time, he found a sort of quiet contentment in his daily routines, nursing a coffee by the window, scanning for moose near the tree line, or listening to radio stations that crackled through static. Solitude was his armor, yet he sometimes wondered if it was also a prison he had built around himself. Though reserved, Ethan wasn't unfriendly. Twice a month, he'd drive into town for supplies. Locals soon recognized him as that quiet fellow in the old truck. He'd chat with the hardware store clerk or the few regulars at a tiny diner, but deeper connections eluded him, and he never pushed. He liked his boundaries intact. Yet, deep in his chest, he carried a subtle ache. He saw it in fleeting moments, when a toddler giggled with her mother in the store or when a couple held hands in the diner booth. He recognized a longing for human closeness, for a sense of belonging. But each time, he'd shake it off, reminding himself of the heartbreak he'd once endured. Life went on quietly for years, with Ethan mostly keeping to himself and the rugged land. He rose at dawn to watch pastel colors brush the horizon. He spent afternoons gathering firewood, occasionally spotting eagles overhead. At night, in his small cabin warmed by a wood stove, he'd read well-worn paperbacks or tinker with old guitar strings, a skill he'd taught himself after his father's passing. He believed he had found his permanent rhythm. Yet, destiny has a way of revealing itself in the most unexpected encounters. One crisp autumn afternoon, as leaves turned to gold and a chill brushed the air, Ethan's path crossed with a gravely wounded creature. That moment would yank him from his safe cocoon of isolation, propelling him into a bond he never anticipated. The stage was set for a story of survival and empathy, one that would test his courage and unravel the walls he had so carefully built. Autumn in Alaska transforms the landscape into a kaleidoscope of amber and rust, especially along the Kenai Peninsula. On this particular day, Ethan had decided to follow a less-traveled hiking route behind his cabin. The trail snaked through dense spruce and hemlock, with patches of crimson fireweed edging the forest floor. Overhead, the sky was a sapphire expanse, the sun dipping lower as it promised an early Arctic sunset. He carried minimal gear, just a backpack with a thermos of coffee, a first aid kit, and a well-worn paperback that he planned to read by a hidden creek. The crisp air invigorated him, each breath filling his lungs with the promise of new beginnings, though he wasn't fully aware of it yet. Hours passed in pleasant solitude. Ethan paused to sip coffee on a fallen log, scanning for signs of wildlife, a flash of fox fur, the silent flight of an owl. He noticed fresh claw marks on a tree trunk, a bear's territory. Typically, this would prompt caution, but Ethan felt no threat. Bears were common here, and as long as he respected their space, they usually avoided him. Eventually, he left the main trail to explore deeper into the wilderness. Thick moss cushioned each step, and he relished how the hush enveloped him. Suddenly, he froze. A stifled whine, almost a grunt, cut through the stillness. At first, he wondered if it was just the wind, but then he heard it again, a wheezing moan that sent a jolt of alarm up his spine. Ethan moved forward cautiously, stepping through tangled undergrowth. Then he saw it. Sprawled at the base of a towering spruce was a grizzly bear, massive even in its weakened state. The bear's ribcage rose and fell in frantic, shallow breaths. Its fur was matted and dull, revealing patches of raw skin. Flies buzzed around dried blood near its flank. One of its eyes was crusted shut, the other half open and glassy with pain. Instinct told Ethan to back away. Grizzlies are apex predators, and even a distressed one could be lethal. But something in him wouldn't let him turn his back. The bear's labored gasps mirrored desperation, and Ethan's heart clenched with an empathy he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as though he recognized in the animal a reflection of his own hidden anguish. He crouched at a distance, trying to assess the situation. The bear, noticing movement, let out a weak growl. It tried to lift its head, but the attempt drained its limited energy. Ethan's pulse hammered, but pity won over fear. The animal was clearly malnourished, parched, and injured, perhaps from a territorial fight, a misjudged scramble over rocky terrain, or even a confrontation with another predator. His rational mind screamed for him to retreat, yet the compassion that welled up inside him refused to yield. Slowly, he unzipped his backpack, retrieving the small first aid kit. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. No training manual recommended approaching a wounded grizzly. But how could he walk away from a dying creature, even if it stood for everything wild and dangerous? For a moment, their eyes locked. He saw in the bear's gaze not the primal ferocity often depicted in nature documentaries, but a dim flicker of resignation, as if the creature was teetering on a precipice, uncertain whether to fight or succumb. Ethan understood the gravity of his choice. He was alone. No cell signal this deep in the woods. Night was approaching. Any misstep could be fatal. Yet, a sense of shared vulnerability urged him onward. Gathering his courage and cursing his own recklessness, he inched closer. In that fragile space between fear and compassion, a bond sparked, one that would alter both their destinies. Ethan's hands trembled as he inched nearer to the bear, rummaging through his limited supplies. What did he realistically hope to do with a meager first aid kit? Still, he refused to abandon hope. He had to try something. Gently, he spoke, his voice low and steady, as though comforting a frightened child. Of course, the bear couldn't understand words, but maybe the calm tone would soothe it, or at least keep it from lashing out in panic. Up close, the bear's condition appeared dire. Fresh gashes along its torso oozed a sticky discharge, and its hind leg had an obvious wound that looked infected. The acrid smell of decay choked Ethan's throat. Every ragged breath the bear took sent a spasm through its massive body. Closer inspection suggested it had been lying in the same spot for days, unable to move for water or food. Ethan tore strips from a clean shirt he kept in his backpack and soaked them in antiseptic from his kit, pitifully small for such a large wound, but it was better than nothing. Reaching out with trembling caution, he pressed the makeshift bandage to the oozing gashes. The bear jolted, releasing a guttural noise halfway between a moan and a growl. Ethan recoiled, heart hammering, expecting a lunge, but the bear slumped back, too weakened to launch an attack. In that moment, Ethan wished for the presence of professional wildlife rescuers or a veterinarian. He pictured an advanced clinic with sedation and sterile instruments, but the nearest help was miles away, and he had no way of contacting anyone from here. The Alaskan wilderness offered no easy solutions. He worked as gently as possible, cleaning away dirt and debris, trying to wash out the worst of the infection with bottled water. Each time the bear flinched or let out a pained groan, Ethan winced with guilt. He whispered more reassurances, though they felt painfully inadequate. Time slipped by in a blur of anxious effort. The sun sank lower, painting the treetops in fiery hues. Darkness loomed, and the temperature would soon drop. Ethan realized he couldn't leave the bear out here to freeze, not in its condition. But how could he move a creature that outweighed him by several hundred pounds? His mind raced, sifting through possibilities. Maybe he could rig a sled of branches or a makeshift stretcher, yet he doubted the bear could tolerate the jostling. If it were to have any hope of survival, immediate and more robust care was necessary. Another wave of uncertainty seized him, but he refused to give in to despair. A plan formed, equal parts desperate and insane. He'd try to transport the bear to his cabin. It was at least a few miles of rough terrain, but if he could figure out how to stabilize the animal, there might be a chance to keep it alive until he could call for professional help. With time, a veterinarian from Anchorage or a rescue group like the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center, known for rehabilitating injured bears, could intervene. Stepping away, he scavenged the forest floor for fallen branches sturdy enough to form a frame. Using rope from his pack, he lashed them together, improvising a type of travois. Sweat beaded his brow in the chill air, each snap of a branch felt like an echo of urgency. Meanwhile, the bear lay panting in feeble breaths, its body occasionally trembling. When Ethan finally finished the contraption, he approached the bear again, apologizing in hushed tones for the pain he was about to cause. With immense caution, he managed to roll the bear onto the wooden frame. It released a weak roar that reverberated through the silent forest, but it didn't resist. Perhaps it lacked the energy, or perhaps some primordial trust had sparked in its pain-dulled mind. Securing the bear with ropes, Ethan tested the travois. It groaned under the animal's weight, but it might hold if he moved slowly. The hardest part was yet to come, dragging a dying grizzly over miles of uneven terrain with darkness creeping in. Ethan steeled himself, gripping the makeshift handles, straining muscles, and ignoring the pounding of his heart. He set off, step by agonizing step, determined to give the bear a fighting chance. The woods were already growing dim, twilight weaving shadows between the towering spruce trees. Even under normal circumstances, walking these rugged miles back to his cabin would be challenging. Now, weighed down by a massive, half-conscious grizzly, it felt akin to dragging a boulder up a mountain. Ethan's boots sank into moss and mud, snagging on exposed roots. The travois rattled over rocks, sending jolts of pain through the injured animal, which groaned weakly in response. Every muscle in Ethan's body screamed for rest, but he had no time to indulge. With each step, the bear's survival window shrank. He pressed on, sweat pouring down his face despite the chilly air. Occasionally, he paused to breathe, quickly checking the improvised bandages. Blood still seeped, but the bleeding seemed slower. He prayed that was a sign of hope. As dusk morphed into night, the moon rose above the treetops, its pale light a tenuous guide through thick underbrush. A few times, Ethan stumbled, nearly dropping the travois. Fear spiked, imagining how a jarring tumble could reopen the bear's wounds. Yet each time, he managed to keep it upright. He whispered apologies and soothing words to the semi-conscious creature, unsure if it even registered his attempts at comfort. At the halfway mark, Ethan nearly collapsed. His arms felt like dead weights, his thighs burned. He considered the chilling possibility, if he fainted out here, they'd both die, him from exposure, the bear from its injuries. Summoning the last of his endurance, he recalled his father's mantra during tough situations, one step at a time, son. And so, he continued, focusing on one footfall after another, refusing to let exhaustion or fear override the sense of purpose surging within him. After what felt like an endless trek, he recognized the outline of his cabin's wooden structure through a thinning cluster of trees. Relief flooded him, he had made it, but the challenge wasn't over. He still had to get the bear inside or at least under some shelter. Inside the cabin, with a fire, he could maintain a stable temperature while calling for help. So, he guided the travois to the small porch. With trembling hands, he unlatched the door. Thankfully, his cabin's open floor plan meant fewer obstacles, yet maneuvering the travois through the narrow entrance was an awkward struggle. The bear growled softly, as if protesting in the cramped space. At last, the travois slid across the cabin's wooden floor, coming to rest near the stone fireplace. Ethan, chest heaving, sank to his knees. He'd done it. Though for how long the bear would stay alive remained uncertain. The next urgent task was to connect with a phone line or radio. The cabin had a basic landline phone for emergencies, but service could be spotty. He prayed it still worked. His legs wobbled as he stood up and rushed to the small table by the kitchen, fumbling for the handset. He dialed the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center, a group known for rehabilitating large mammals. A recorded message directed him to an after-hours hotline. Clenching his teeth, he left a message: "I have an injured adult grizzly bear at my cabin near Kenai Peninsula. It's in critical condition. Please, I need help. Call me back at this number." Hanging up, he called a local veterinarian but got voicemail again. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. He dialed a second rescue number, then a third. Each time, he either left a message or encountered a busy tone. The region was vast, rescue teams were few, and immediate help might not come easily. Still, he refused to accept defeat. By now, night had fully set in. The wind outside howled, rattling the cabin windows. Turning to the bear, Ethan saw its eyes were closed, chest heaving in slow, ragged gulps. He tossed extra logs onto the fireplace to keep the space warm, then knelt at the bear's side. "Hang in there," he whispered, resting a hand gently against its coarse fur in the flickering firelight. The battered animal looked impossibly vulnerable. Exhaustion tugged at Ethan's eyelids, but he forced himself to stay awake. He'd keep vigil through the night if he had to. For some inexplicable reason, this creature's fate mattered to him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Together, under a roof battered by wind and overshadowed by dire uncertainty, they braced against the darkness, clinging to a fragile strand of hope. That night seemed to stretch into eternity. Ethan alternated between adjusting the bear's bandages, stoking the fire, and checking the phone in case someone returned his calls. The wind outside whistled like a lament, and each gust sent chills down his spine. He fought to keep his composure, running through every possible scenario. What if no one came? What if he had to watch the bear die right here on his cabin floor? He brewed strong coffee on his wood stove, sipping it to stay alert. Every so often, the bear stirred, issuing low groans. Carefully, Ethan used a damp cloth to clean away dried blood and sweat from the animal's snout, mindful not to cause more pain. The creature's half-lidded eyes followed him occasionally, almost as if trying to understand this bizarre turn of events. Around midnight, the phone rang. Adrenaline shot through Ethan as he lunged to answer. It was a volunteer from a local wildlife rescue group. "We got your message," the woman said hurriedly. "Most of our team is out on another emergency call. We're stretched thin, but the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center has been notified. They might dispatch someone by morning if the roads are clear." He thanked her profusely, relief and anxiety battling inside him. Morning was hours away. The roads might be tough to navigate in the dark, especially in remote territory. For now, it was just him and the bear. 1 hour bled into another, and Ethan found himself dozing off in short bursts, only to jolt awake whenever the bear wheezed or the fire crackled too loudly. In these moments, fragmented memories of his parents drifted through his mind: the hospital corridor where he first heard the news, the cold funeral, the outpouring of community support he tried to shun. He realized how rarely he let himself remember these things. Something about the bear's plight peeled away his defenses, reminding him how fragile life could be. Gradually, he noticed an odd change in the bear's breathing. The frantic panting had eased, replaced by longer, more rhythmic breaths. The animal's body, while still trembling, seemed less rigid. Could this be a sign of recovery, or was it just a lull in a downward spiral? Deciding to be thorough, Ethan prepared a rudimentary saline solution by boiling water and dissolving salt. Carefully, he dabbed it onto the bear's wounds to keep them clean. The process earned him some grunts and squirming, but the bear no longer seemed on the verge of snapping at him. A peculiar trust had formed, or perhaps the bear was too weak to retaliate. Regardless, Ethan felt an unspoken connection. Dawn approached, graying the windows. Ethan's eyes stung from sleeplessness. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving a hush across the land. He stepped onto the porch briefly to breathe in the cold morning air. Snow flurries danced, transforming the forest into a scene of frosted stillness. He glimpsed wolf tracks in the distance, a reminder of the wildness that lurked beyond. Returning inside, he found the bear watching him, not in an aggressive way, but with a certain alertness that hadn't been there before. Ethan found himself speaking softly. "You made it through the night, big guy. Let's hope the cavalry arrives soon." He almost felt foolish talking to an animal, but he couldn't deny that it brought a sliver of comfort to both of them. Seconds later, the phone rang again, a jarring intrusion. Scrambling to answer, Ethan heard a gruff voice introduce himself as Mark Bradley, a ranger from the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center. "I'm on my way," Mark said, "but it'll take a few hours. The storm slowed us down." In the meantime, do what you can to keep the bear calm and warm." Setting the receiver down, Ethan glanced at the grizzly, relief blooming in his chest. Help was coming. Maybe, just maybe, this courageous leap into the unknown wouldn't end in tragedy. He leaned against the wall, exhaling the tension he had held for so long. The sun finally broke over the horizon, sending pale light across the cabin floor and over the battered shape of a living, fighting bear who, against all odds, was still holding on. It was almost midday when a pickup truck rumbled up Ethan's driveway, tires crunching against the freshly dusted snow. Relief cascaded through him. He hurried to the porch, heart pounding, to greet the visitors. Two figures stepped out, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a ranger uniform and a woman with sharp eyes, likely a veterinarian. The man extended his hand. "Mark Bradley," he said in a low, reassuring voice. "This is Dr. Elaine Porter." Ethan shook their hands, quickly ushering them inside. They carried gear, medical bags, a tranquilizer gun, and a portable oxygen tank. The moment Dr. Porter laid eyes on the bear, her professional detachment slipped, replaced by a flash of empathy. "Poor thing," she murmured, kneeling beside the wounded creature. Mark stepped around, methodically assessing the scene with practiced eyes. Ethan explained everything as succinctly as possible: the encounter in the forest, the hours-long struggle to bring the bear here, the night spent cleaning wounds and praying for survival. Dr. Porter nodded, unpacking syringes and antiseptics. She administered a gentle sedative, carefully checking the bear's vitals. The animal flinched but didn't resist as fiercely as Ethan had feared. Mark rummaged through a field kit, pulling out a digital scale meant for smaller wildlife. Realizing the bear's size, he exchanged a rueful grin with Ethan. "We won't be weighing this fellow easily," he said. "But he's got to be at least 800 pounds, underweight for his frame, which suggests he was quite starved." Once sedated, the bear's breathing slowed, the tension draining from its muscles. Dr. Porter worked swiftly, irrigating wounds, applying stronger antibiotics, and stitching up deeper gashes. "These injuries are extensive," she explained. "Likely from a fight with another large male, or possibly a moose. Infection is our biggest enemy right now." Ethan hovered close, assisting whenever she asked for supplies. He marveled at her calm precision. She had a sure-handed confidence that only came from years of encountering dire cases. Meanwhile, Mark prepared a specialized transport crate outside. "We need to move him soon," Mark said, "but traveling might be risky in his condition. Let's see how he stabilizes first." It took nearly 2 hours for Dr. Porter to finish the emergency care. At last, she straightened, wiping sweat from her brow. "He's responding better than I expected," she said softly. "Your efforts probably saved his life." The words hit Ethan with surprising force. He hadn't fully recognized the magnitude of what he'd done. He had simply seen a wounded creature and couldn't look away. Mark placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I've seen folks turn a blind eye to suffering animals before. What you did, it's rare, and it's brave." A swirl of gratitude and humility washed over Ethan. He realized that for the first time in years, he had allowed himself to care deeply about another living being. The emptiness he carried since his parents' death felt a bit lighter, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. With the bear sedated, Mark and Dr. Porter debated the next step. The Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center had facilities for large mammals, but the roads were hardly ideal for transporting a severely injured animal. They decided to give the bear a day or two to stabilize in Ethan's cabin before risking the drive. Over the following days, Ethan's cabin became a hub of activity. Mark and Dr. Porter came and went, checking on the bear, providing treatments, and marveling at its incremental improvements. The once grievous wounds were slowly sealing, though infection remained a risk. They administered medication regularly, adjusting dosages based on the bear's weight and progress. Ethan found himself wholly engrossed. He rose at dawn to check the 4-drip, replaced soiled bandages, and carefully fed the bear small amounts of a nutrient paste Dr. Porter provided. Amazingly, the bear responded better each day, stirring more alertly whenever Ethan approached. It was as if the creature recognized Ethan's scent, though a part of him doubted such an emotional bond could form so quickly. Yet even Mark, seasoned in wildlife rescue, remarked on the bear's calmness in Ethan's presence. "I've seen injured bears lash out in terror," he told Ethan, "but this big guy doesn't seem threatened by you. He's more at ease than I'd expect given the circumstances." Ethan, for his part, felt a swell of emotion he could barely articulate. Maybe it was relief that the bear wasn't dead. Maybe it was a sense of fulfillment, feeling truly needed for the first time in years. Nights still belonged to his old loneliness, but now that quiet was filled with the soft breathing of a creature that clung to life, partly due to his efforts. One afternoon, a few days into the bear's stay, Ethan sat on the floor beside the sleeping animal, reading a tattered paperback about Alaskan wildlife. He'd come across references to the spiritual significance of bears in certain native Alaskan traditions, how they were revered as guardians of the forest. He closed the book, gaze drifting to the bear's flank. For a moment, he sensed an odd spiritual connection, like they were two lost souls, each healing from wounds seen and unseen. Meanwhile, Dr. Porter began discussing the future. "If the bear makes a strong recovery, we'll move him to the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center. He'll undergo rehabilitation, and if everything goes well, we'll release him back into the wild eventually." Ethan nodded, but an unexpected pang of sadness clutched his chest. The logical part of him recognized that a wild grizzly belonged in its natural habitat, not in a human's cabin. But the emotional side had grown used to the presence of those deep brown eyes, the rumbling breaths that filled the living room at night. The next morning, Mark arrived earlier than usual, carrying fresh medical supplies. He found Ethan outside, staring at the horizon. "You okay?" the ranger asked, reading the pensive look on Ethan's face. Ethan offered a small shrug. "Just thinking about what happens next. When you move him to the center, will he even remember any of this? Or me?" Mark scratched his beard, choosing his words carefully. "Hard to say. Bears are smart. They have memories, sure, but not in the same emotional context we do. Don't be surprised if he never acknowledges you the same way a domesticated animal might. But that doesn't erase what you've done for him." Ethan nodded, absorbing that truth. It was a gentle reminder of the boundaries between human empathy and wild instincts. Yet, in his heart, he felt a fierce sense of protectiveness for the creature he'd saved. A quiet moment passed before Mark clapped him on the shoulder. "Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't mean we get anything in return. But that's what makes it right, you know." Ethan managed a half-smile. He recognized the wisdom in Mark's words. Still, it didn't ease the growing lump in his throat each time he considered letting the bear go. He realized he had discovered a new dimension of himself, someone who could love fiercely despite the risk of loss. In saving a life, he'd found an anchor for his own drifting spirit. Days blended into a routine of care and cautious optimism. Although the bear remained silent except for the occasional growl or grunt, Ethan found himself calling it Kodiak, inspired by the massive grizzlies native to the region. Mark teased him about naming a wild bear, but even Dr. Porter admitted it felt more personal to refer to him as Kodiak. Eventually, the entire rescue team used the moniker, albeit with professional detachment. Word of Ethan's rescue effort spread through the local community. The volunteer who first called him back posted an update on social media, praising his actions. Soon, neighbors who'd barely spoken more than a few words to Ethan were calling to ask if they could help. Mrs. Foster from the diner offered to bring hot meals for him and the rescue workers. A teacher from the local school asked if her students could write get-well cards for the hero bear. Gradually, the story gained traction beyond the Kenai Peninsula. News outlets picked it up, spinning headlines about the recluse who saved a dying bear. Ethan cringed at the sensationalism, but Mark insisted the publicity could help gather funds for wildlife rescue. In fact, the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center saw a surge in small donations from people moved by the saga. The center's director, a no-nonsense woman named Maria Sullivan, contacted Ethan personally to express gratitude and plan for Kodiak's eventual transfer. Amid the sudden attention, Ethan experienced conflicting emotions. On one hand, it felt good to see positive responses, to realize that compassion resonated with so many strangers. But a part of him felt exposed. He had built his life around privacy, and now people wanted interviews or photos of him with the bear. He politely declined most media requests, letting Mark or Dr. Porter handle the questions. The moment he was asked, "Why did you risk your life?" he found himself tongue-tied, struggling to express the intangible drive that made him do it. Away from the spotlight, inside the cabin, Kodiak continued to recover. His coat regained some luster, though the scars would remain. He occasionally tested his legs by shifting his weight, letting out a startled huff when pain flared. Dr. Porter taught Ethan how to administer injections for the antibiotic schedule. Each time, Ethan steadied his hand, reminding himself that these pricks of discomfort served a greater good. One afternoon, Ethan received a call from a family friend he hadn't spoken to in years. The old neighbor had seen the bear's rescue story on a local news channel and recognized Ethan's name. They spoke for a while, reminiscing about Ethan's parents. After hanging up, Ethan felt an ache in his chest, like he'd finally bridged a gap between his old life and the new. And it dawned on him that maybe he didn't have to isolate himself in eternal grief. Compassion had opened a door to reconnect with people who once mattered. Gradually, Kodiak stood up on his own, albeit shakily. The day Ethan came home from a supply run and found Kodiak half-standing, front paws braced against the floor, a jolt of excitement coursed through him. He called Dr. Porter to report the improvement, beaming like a proud parent sharing a toddler's first steps. Through it all, the synergy of care enveloped the cabin, the combined efforts of Ethan, Mark, Dr. Porter, and the supportive local community. Over the phone, Maria Sullivan confirmed they had a specialized enclosure ready at the conservation center. "He's going to have the best chance of a return to the wild," she assured Ethan. As plans took shape, Ethan found himself wrestling with a bittersweet realization. Each step of Kodiak's healing journey was another step closer to goodbye. While the thought weighed on him, he also recognized the beauty in it. After all, isn't that what healing often demands? Courage to face the possibility of letting go, trusting that life persists in wondrous ways beyond our personal attachments. After weeks of diligent care, The day arrived when Kodiak was deemed fit enough to travel to the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center. A specialized transport cage arrived on a trailer, accompanied by a team of professionals. They tranquilized Kodiak one last time, ensuring a smooth transition for the hours-long journey ahead. Watching the bear slump into sedation stirred a mix of relief and sorrow in Ethan's chest. Dr. Porter oversaw the sedation with her usual steady competence while Mark helped guide the massive creature into the enclosure, ensuring no undue stress on his healing wounds. Ethan hovered at the periphery, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. As the truck pulled away, he glimpsed the bear's tranquilized form, peaceful as though in a deep sleep. A swell of emotion clenched his throat, but he resisted the urge to linger on regrets. This was the right choice. Weeks later, Ethan found himself driving to the Wildlife Center at Mark Bradley's invitation. The facility sprawled across acres of lush terrain, with enclosures designed to replicate natural habitats for injured or orphaned animals. Children on field trips wandered wide-eyed, pressing their noses against protective glass to see wolves or moose. The crisp Alaskan air carried the scent of pine and wet earth. Maria Sullivan greeted him at the main lodge. She was a brisk, energetic woman whose face lit up when she shook Ethan's hand. "I've been wanting to meet the man behind the rescue," she said. "We owe Kodiak's survival largely to you." She guided Ethan to a behind-the-scenes area normally off-limits to visitors. There, in a fenced enclosure ringed by thick steel bars, Kodiak ambled slowly, favoring a back leg that still bore healing scars. A caretaker tossed a chunk of salmon into the enclosure. Kodiak sniffed, then carefully devoured it. The thick brown fur along his flank remained patchy, but his eyes looked bright and aware. Ethan stood quietly, an odd lump forming in his throat. He couldn't deny the relief flooding him at the sight of Kodiak on his feet, living, surviving. Maria explained the plan: daily veterinary checks, a carefully balanced diet, and minimal human contact to prevent habituation. Over time, if Kodiak continued improving, he could be released into a protected wilderness area. That final stage might be months or even a year away, but it was on the horizon. Mark joined them, clasping Ethan's shoulder. "You did well, Caldwell," he said simply. "I hope you know that." Turning to face them, Ethan tried to articulate his gratitude. I never imagined it would turn out like this," he said. "I'm just glad he made it. And all of you helped make that happen." A silence settled, broken only by the distant chatter of other visitors. Maria pivoted to a lighter note, guiding Ethan on a short tour of the facility. They passed enclosures for orphaned lynx cubs, a wounded bald eagle with a splint on its wing, and moose calves learning to feed. Each animal had a story, each rescue a testament to the center's mission. The staff, fueled by compassion, mirrored the sense of purpose Ethan had tapped into during Kodiak's darkest hours. Before parting ways, Maria offered Ethan a volunteer position. "If you ever want to be involved with wildlife rehab, we could always use a dedicated hand. You've shown you have the heart for it." Ethan's eyes flickered with a shy smile. Once upon a time, he would have balked at the notion of working with others or diving into something that demanded emotional investment. But now, he felt a growing willingness to step beyond his self-imposed boundaries. On the drive back to his cabin, Ethan mulled over the unexpected turn his life had taken. His parents' loss had once carved an unfillable void in him, but through caring for Kodiak, he had discovered a flicker of healing. Perhaps this was the beginning of a new path, one where empathy and courage replaced isolation and fear. Returning to his cabin, Ethan noticed small changes in how he perceived the place. Previously, it had symbolized solitude, his safe haven from a world he believed had let him down. Now, it felt like the launching pad of an extraordinary bond, proof that even in remote isolation, compassion could spark remarkable connections. He stepped inside and found the living room emptier without Kodiak's massive presence. Sunlight angled through the window, illuminating the spot near the fireplace where the bear had once lain, fighting for his life. Ethan set down his keys, crossing to that exact place. Memory flickered, the pungent smell of antiseptic, the flickering glow of the fire on matted fur, the frantic nights of vigil. The echoes filled him with a sense of reverence. He spent the next few days tying up details he had neglected. The phone kept ringing, reporters still hoping for exclusive interviews, neighbors checking in, the local volunteer group asking if he'd speak at a small school event. Normally, he would have brushed off these invitations, but a new inclination tugged at him. Perhaps he could share Kodiak's story, if only to inspire others about the power of empathy. He also made plans to meet with Maria Sullivan again. Her offer to volunteer at the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center lingered in his mind, stirring both excitement and trepidation. Could he handle the emotional toll of working with wounded animals regularly? What if the heartbreak of losing one proved too heavy? And yet, something about living with that risk felt more alive than continuing to remain behind emotional walls. If the rescue had taught him anything, it was that caring deeply might be painful, but it also breathed life into the soul. To ease his swirling thoughts, Ethan busied himself with chores. He chopped wood for winter, fixed a loose door hinge, and even strummed his old guitar on the porch. The crisp air tasted different now, less lonely. A few times, an unfamiliar car passed by, and the driver might honk in friendly recognition. The local diner owner dropped by with fresh-baked bread, leaving it on his doorstep along with a note that read, "Thank you for saving Kodiak. Your kindness inspires us all." One evening, Mark swung by unannounced, offering a modest pat on Ethan's porch railing. He brought a small cooler of fresh fish, presumably from some local catch. Over a simple meal, they talked about the next steps in Kodiak's rehabilitation, the upcoming winter storms, and life in general. Mark shared snippets of his childhood in Anchorage, his passion for wildlife. In turn, Ethan opened up about losing his parents, about how he had escaped to the Kenai Peninsula to outrun grief. The conversation was raw and comforting in equal measure. Before leaving, Mark asked, "So, are you going to volunteer at the center?" Ethan shrugged, but a hint of a smile touched his lips. "I'm leaning that way. Feels like something I should do." "Good," Mark replied. "You have a knack for it. Don't let fear keep you away from something meaningful." After Mark's truck disappeared down the driveway, Ethan lingered outside, gazing at the star-flecked sky. He felt a stirring of optimism. The same wilderness that once symbolized his isolation now seemed brimming with possibility. Yes, the path ahead was uncertain. He might face heartbreak or discover new callings, or both. But he sensed that true growth required stepping into the unknown. Within a week, Ethan made up his mind. He would volunteer at the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center, at least part-time. He phoned Maria Sullivan, who welcomed him enthusiastically. The center was about a 2-hour drive from his cabin, but for a worthwhile cause, the commute felt inconsequential. His first day on-site was humbling. Dressed in work boots and gloves, he assisted staff with mundane but crucial tasks, cleaning enclosures, preparing specialized diets, and observing daily feeding routines. He expected to feel out of place, but the staff treated him with warmth. They recognized him from the Kodiak rescue story, but more than that, they valued his willingness to learn. The center housed a variety of Alaskan animals in various stages of recovery: bald eagles with pinned wings, orphaned moose calves, a lynx nursing an injured paw. Each had a name and a story, just as Kodiak did. Some would be released back into the wild once healed. Others, too injured or accustomed to humans, would remain in a protected environment for life. Ethan shadowed Dr. Porter, who introduced him to the daily routines of veterinary checks. She guided him through basic tasks, assessing breathing patterns, administering oral medications, scanning for signs of distress. Observing her skillful handling of animals reminded him of the night she had helped Kodiak in his cabin. "You've come a long way," she noted, handing him a stethoscope. "From a lone caretaker to an integral part of the team." They approached Kodiak's enclosure last. The bear paced slowly, his limp still evident but improving. Dr. Porter gestured for Ethan to step forward. "He's more active these days. We're ensuring minimal direct contact, but you can watch from here." Ethan's heart fluttered as he recognized the same soulful gaze. Kodiak was no longer the near-skeletal form he'd rescued. The bear's coat, though still patchy, had regained a sheen, muscles filling out. When Kodiak turned, their eyes locked for a brief moment. The bear paused, sniffing the air as if catching a familiar scent. Ethan felt a wave of emotion, unsure if Kodiak truly remembered him. Yet, in that fleeting second, a sense of quiet acknowledgement sparked in the bear's gaze. For the following weeks, Ethan balanced cabin life with volunteer shifts at the center. He tackled tasks that might seem menial, scrubbing floors, hauling feed, but found himself immersed in each moment. The staff appreciated his dedication, and he gradually learned the nuances of wildlife medicine from Dr. Porter and her team. Mark popped by occasionally, taking Ethan into the field for rescue calls. Each small triumph or heartbreaking loss reinforced the raw reality of this work. Through it all, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The routines of caring for creatures who depended on him allowed him to channel the compassion he'd once suppressed. He opened up more to the staff, even forging friendships. The swirling guilt and loneliness he'd carried since his parents' accident began to ease, replaced by a bond of shared mission. It wasn't always easy. Some animals didn't make it, succumbing to injuries or infections. Those days were tough, leaving Ethan drained and teary-eyed. But the successes, the deer that learned to walk again, the bald eagle released into the sky with a triumphant screech, fueled his resolve. He saw that the cycle of life in the wilderness was both harsh and beautiful, and that humans, too, had a role to play in preserving that balance. At night, back at his cabin, he'd often reflect on Kodiak's journey, the old wounds, the sedation, the slow progress. Something about the bear's unrelenting struggle to survive mirrored Ethan's own quiet battle. As Kodiak mended physically, Ethan felt he was also mending emotionally, reawakening to the possibility that caring for others might be the key to healing himself. The months rolled by, filled with incremental victories and sobering lessons. Kodiak, now close to a healthy weight, exhibited robust strength. Dr. Porter performed one final checkup, announcing that the bear was nearly ready for release into a carefully chosen wilderness area. The plan spurred both excitement and trepidation among the staff. Releasing a grizzly who'd survived dire circumstances required strategic planning, ensuring enough territory, minimal human interactions, and a location with ample resources. On a crisp morning, Ethan arrived at the center to find an air of ceremony. Maria Sullivan had arranged for a small press gathering, just a handful of local reporters anxious to see the famed rescue bear embark on the last step of his rehabilitation. Ethan felt uneasy about the cameras but understood the significance. Showcasing Kodiak's journey could inspire donations and greater public awareness about wildlife conservation. They transferred Kodiak into a specially designed transport cage loaded onto a trailer. The bear's eyes, alert and calm, scanned the staff for any sign of threat. Ethan stood at the edge, hands folded, battling a swirl of emotions. Mark offered a reassuring nod. Dr. Porter tapped Ethan's shoulder. "You ready to see him off?" "Ready as I'll ever be," Ethan murmured. He couldn't help recalling that first day in the forest, the near-death state, the frantic rescue attempts, the nights spent in sleepless vigilance. Now, Kodiak stood as a testament to resilience. If that bear could recover from mortal wounds, perhaps Ethan, too, could truly move past his parents' loss and the years spent in emotional exile. A convoy of 2 vehicles set out for the designated wilderness site, a protected zone in the Chugach National Forest, far from major roads. The drive took hours over rough terrain. Finally, they reached a secluded spot near a pristine river, enclosed by towering evergreens and rocky slopes. A perfect place for a grizzly to roam free, fish for salmon, and re-establish its natural rhythms. Everyone disembarked, setting up a perimeter to ensure the release went smoothly. Mark and a fellow ranger opened the trailer's gate carefully, while Dr. Porter stood by with a tranquilizer rifle just in case Kodiak became disoriented or aggressive. Ethan lingered a few paces behind, heart thundering in his chest. At first, Kodiak hesitated, sniffing the air as if tasting freedom. Then, with a sudden push, he lumbered out onto the soft ground. The watchers held their breath. Kodiak glanced around, taking in the vastness. The tension broke as the bear sauntered forward, a bit stiff from confinement but decidedly in control. He paused briefly, turning his head in Ethan's direction. Their eyes met in one lingering moment. Ethan's breath caught. He didn't dare move or blink. He could have sworn that in that fleeting exchange, there was a glimmer of familiarity, like a silent farewell. Then, Kodiak continued on, crossing the clearing toward the tree line. No dramatic roar, no flamboyant show of gratitude, just a wild beast returning to where it belonged. When the bear disappeared among the pines, an unspoken hush gripped the group. Mark exhaled. Dr. Porter lowered her rifle. Maria wiped at her eyes. The small gathering of onlookers seemed collectively moved, as though witnessing a miracle. Ethan felt tears prick his eyes, not out of sadness, but from the depth of wonder. In that moment, the final chord of Kodiak's rescue resonated within Ethan. He had not only saved a life but discovered a sense of connection that transcended species or personal grief. He understood that healing wasn't about forgetting pain, it was about forging new bonds, new commitments to living wholeheartedly. And sometimes, letting go was the greatest act of love. In the days after Kodiak's release, Ethan found himself in a surreal calm. Gone was the tension of daily care. In its place lay the gentle hum of possibility. He continued volunteering at the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center, devoting time to other animals in need. Each face, be it a moose calf with a fractured leg or a bald eagle recovering from a damaged wing, reminded him of the universal drive to survive and the power of a helping hand. People occasionally asked Ethan about Kodiak, curious if he missed the bear or harbored any illusions of them reuniting in the wild. Ethan learned to smile and gently explain that a grizzly's place was in nature, free and untethered. He'd share the story without romanticizing it, emphasizing the reality that wildlife demands respect for its independence. Yet, deep inside, he nurtured a quiet hope that somewhere out in the Chugach National Forest, Kodiak was thriving, loping along riverbanks and claiming a territory of his own. He also turned more attention to his personal life. He repaired his cabin's rickety porch, envisioning future guests who might visit and share a cup of coffee. He opened up to old acquaintances, reconnecting with the few people from his past who still reached out. Surprisingly, he found that the locals welcomed him warmly, no longer seeing him as the aloof hermit but as the compassionate man who stepped up for a wounded bear. Mark, Dr. Porter, and Maria became close friends. They'd occasionally invite Ethan to casual gatherings, barbecues, game nights, or even a weekend fishing trip. At first, Ethan felt pangs of shyness, uncertain how to conduct himself in groups. But the acceptance he encountered eased his doubts. The more he participated in these small joys, the more he realized he'd been starved for human connection. Through volunteer work, Ethan also discovered that he had a knack for speaking calmly to anxious animals and, by extension, to anxious people too. One evening, he pinned a child's crayon drawing of a bear on his cabin wall. It joined a collage of photographs, some of Kodiak, others of the eagles and lynx at the center, a few of Ethan's parents in their younger years. It felt like a tapestry weaving together his past and present, heartbreak, hope, and purpose, all sharing space in a life that no longer felt empty. Kodiak had done more than survive, he had awakened Ethan's capacity to care and connect. And as Ethan settled into this new normal, he understood that love, once unleashed, had a transformative power that went far beyond any single rescue story. The final image he held onto was Kodiak's silhouette fading into the forest, reminding him that, though each journey might be fleeting, the bonds formed could inspire us for a lifetime. Thank you for joining me on this extraordinary journey of compassion and resilience. Ethan Caldwell's decision to save a dying grizzly began as a courageous rescue but evolved into a life-altering bond, proving that empathy can bridge the gap between isolation and profound connection. Through sleepless nights, unwavering dedication, and the collective efforts of caring professionals, the bear named Kodiak found new life and a second chance in the wild. In return, Ethan rediscovered his own capacity for healing, forging friendships, and embracing a fresh purpose that transcended grief. If this story moved or inspired you, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it with friends, and subscribing to my channel for more tales that celebrate the transformative power of hope and kindness. Your engagement helps these uplifting stories reach people who could use a reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion can change lives, human and animal alike. Thank you.